Hello everyone. My name is Daichi, and I will give you the lecture regarding the radiation or remediation activities. So, let's start today's lecture. Today's theme is Exposure Situations, Volume 1. Are you ready? Hello, Hikari. Are you buying some medicines?
Oh, Mr. Daichi. Good afternoon. I have consulted the pharmacist, and I have just finished. How about spending a moment for a cup of coffee?
By the way, what kind of medicines did you get today? If you don't mind, please let me know, Hikari.
Well, for today, I asked the pharmacist to prescribe some medicines, according to the symptoms, such as headache, runny nose, cough.
Okay, please take care of yourself. Your talk about symptoms has just reminded me of the categories for the three situations, with regard to exposure to radiation. Let me talk about it, if you don't mind. First of all, let me talk about the categories of exposure situations. These can be categorized into three exposure situations, that is, planned exposure situation, emergency exposure situation, and existing exposure situation. By the way, this concept of exposure situations was first internationally represented in the recommendation of ICRP, the International Commission on Radiation Protection, in 2007. I would like to explain the ICRP, or processes to establish the international standards, in another lecture.
By the way, what is the difference between these three exposure situations?
Okay, let's take a look at each exposure situation in sequence. First situation is the planned exposure situation. To put it simply, this is the situation under which people are exposed to the radiation from the sources, which are introduced and managed as planned. The construction of new nuclear power plants, or the introduction of new radiation sources followed by making research in the laboratory, are representative examples of the planned exposure situation.
Definitely, if we know how much radioactive materials are introduced and where they are stored accurately, we can estimate and manage the amount of exposure dose, in a planned manner.
For the next, the emergency exposure situation. As its name represents, this situation includes exposure derived from the release of radioactive materials into the environment, due to the accident of nuclear power plant. Under the emergency situation, the negative impact on people could happen, which can't be expected in ordinary situation. Therefore, the measures to avert serious impact on people's health are prioritized. Of course, it is quite crucial to understand the situation, as precise as possible, by appropriate monitoring, in order for the evacuation to be implemented minimally, because it could pose serious burden on people. And the last situation is the existing exposure situation. We can take the following cases as representative examples. That is, recovery phase after the emergency exposure situation. The exposure to the natural radiation, emitted from the radioactive materials on Earth or atmosphere. And the exposure to radon indoors, through inhalation.
I see. The aftermath of the emergency situation, or exposure to the radiation from radioactive materials, which we didn't intentionally introduce and can't be controlled by ourselves, are representative examples.
Right. In the next part, Elle would like to explain specific measures in each exposure situation. However, it would take time, so I'd like to explain it in another lecture. So, let me wrap up my lecture by providing you the key points. Today I talked about the three exposure situations, with regard to the exposure to radiation. That is, planned exposure situation, emergency exposure situation, and existing exposure situation. First of all, The planned exposure situation is the situation under which people are exposed to radiation, which are introduced in a planned manner. For example, exposure under the ordinary operation of nuclear power plant, or usage of radioactive materials in research laboratory, are examples of the planned exposure situation. The next situation is the emergency exposure situation. This includes the exposure to radiation, not under the ordinary situation, but emergency situation. And this situation includes, for example, the exposure derived from accident or terrorism in nuclear power plant. The last situation is existing exposure situation. This is the exposure under the recovery phase after the accident, or exposure derived from natural radiation. The exposure during the decontamination activities, after the contamination situation is better understood, or the exposure to radiation emitted from Earth, are examples of this situation. As I said previously, the basic concept of radiation protection in each exposure situation will be explained in another lecture. Okay, today's lecture is now dismissed. See you next time. In this channel, the useful information regarding the radiation and remediation will be provided to you. If you like it, please subscribe to this channel, and do not forget to click the like button.